Hello, and welcome to this channel. This is Painting for Life. My name is Benjamin Hummel. I'm also referred to as the Perspective Professor. I'm an artist, but I'm also a sufferer of primary sclerosing cholangitis. This is a disease of the liver, sometimes referred to as PSC. And in the future, this channel will feature things like art instruction, maybe some stuff on Colorado history, some hiking. But for today, I want to talk to you about my third liver transplant, the remarkable, harrowing, and true story that nearly took my life. Now, some of you may know me, and I'm assuming many do not, so let me give you a quick recap. When I was just a child, I was diagnosed with PSC. It is a disease of the liver bile ducts, and so when I was 15, I required a liver transplant. This liver transplant did not work, and 3 months later, I was on death's door when I received my second liver transplant. Again, I was 15 years old, and at that point, I received a new and fresh take on life. However, the unfortunate thing about PSC is that it is a disease of the immune system. And thus, 7 years later, it recurred. And starting in the year 1999, up until 2025, I was in and out of the hospital dealing with this disease. This brings me to November of last year, 2025. We received a phone call. A perfect liver had been found. Up until this point, I was doing my very best with my condition to try to work as best as possible. I was doing a few art projects here and there. I was teaching at the rec center. But what we knew when that phone call came is that my life would suddenly be interrupted. It would suddenly be put on hold as I dealt with recovery. Now, I was not expecting this recovery to be as challenging, as difficult, as hellish as it ended up being. When I was 15, after I received my second liver transplant, 10 days later, I was released from the hospital, and 20 days later, I was going to a Rockies game. So that was the expectation I had going into this transplant. Boy, was I wrong. Perhaps the difference might have been my age, 15 versus almost 50. But whatever it was, I was not prepared for the road that was ahead of me. Now, this next part is going to get a little long. I'm doing this on purpose because I think it's important to understand just how brutal this surgery was and just how debilitating it was. For those of you who like gory details, well, you're in luck. I promise not to disappoint. The drugs they give you are designed to scramble your brain so that you are not traumatized while you're under. Thus, when I woke up, I did not remember what had happened. I did not remember why I was there. I did know, however, that I was under for a very long time. My first thought was maybe I was in some sort of bad accident or something. I was recovering from a coma. My arms were strapped to the bed, so I could not grab the breathing tube that was in my mouth. They wanted to keep me on the breathing tube for at least 30 minutes of alertness to make sure that I can fully breathe on my own. And so there was 30 minutes where I was trying to figure out what on earth was going on. And as I looked straight ahead, my vision was kind of narrow, but what I could see was the wall on the other side. And for whatever reason, the ICU at UC Health, they painted the walls teal. Teal. I was expecting white. So when I'm looking ahead at these teal walls, I was really confused as to where I was and what was going on. I asked my wife for pencil and paper so I could scribble out a few notes and figure out what had happened. And once she figured out what I was trying to ask her, she told me the following. Now, because from 1999 up to 2025, when I received this third liver transplant, I had had multiple gut surgeries, whether it was on my small intestine or whatever it happened to be, hernia. They had opened and closed me many times, and the result was I formed a ton of scar tissue in my abdominal cavity. This scar tissue acts like cement. And so they had to cut away at this scar tissue in order to access my liver. The other problem is that this scar tissue had developed its own vascular system. And so as they were cutting through it, they were splitting arteries and veins, and blood was going everywhere. 50 pints of blood was required to keep me alive during this procedure. I was told later on that they normally have a defibrillator on hand because they expect someone to get that much blood transfusion to have a reaction that stops their heart. Your body's just not used to having that much of somebody else's blood in it. It's an expectation that they're going to have to restart your heart. My heart never stopped. This astounded the doctors, and they even said so after I woke up. They couldn't believe it. They could not believe that my heart did not stop with all of that blood transfusion. The entire surgery lasted a staggering 18 hours, but they weren't done. When they were finished, they wheeled me back into the ICU, still open, to wait for an additional 24 hours before they put me back into surgery to wash out all that excess blood and gunk that had accumulated during the surgery. Then they sewed me up and put me back into the ICU. So I literally was under the anesthetic for 2 straight days. That is why when I woke up, I had the sensation that it had been a very long time. That was only 2 days, so it wasn't that long, but I realized that a lot of time had passed. Being under for 2 straight days, your body stops working. My arms felt like they weighed 50 pounds each. I could barely move. It was horrifying. I was connected to several tubes, including a tube that went into my chest to drain off the fluids. That was very painful. An NG tube into my nose to drain off of my stomach, a Foley, a dialysis was connected to me. I had a couple IVs in my jugular as well as a couple IVs in my hands. I was just fully connected. Usually, on the first day after a liver transplant, they like to administer a standing test. So what they do is they raise the bed up 90 degrees, and with a couple of nurses around you, they see if you can support your own weight. Most people fail this test, and it's not a big deal. They just want to see what kind of strength that you have. I actually was able to stand up. Now, granted, it was very difficult. I could not believe how challenging it was to stand up. If you pass the standing test, they next try a sitting test. And so while you're standing, you walk a couple steps over to the chair, and with all the nurses around you to help you rotate 180 degrees with all the cords and tubes and everything connected to you. And then you sit down onto the chair. I was able to do that as well. They told me later, nobody makes it to the sitting test. However, I do remember in that moment, not being able to stand up on my own very well and certainly having very limited mobility, how scary that was. I did not like the sensation of having to rely on somebody else to take care of me. That was the most horrifying thing to me. That sense of helplessness put a fire in me. I would do whatever I could to strengthen myself so I would not have to be in this position for long. By day 4, I was actually starting to recover. I was doing pretty well. The NG tube had been removed. The Foley had been removed. I started to have more mobility. And there was a trajectory that I was actually improving. That's when disaster happened. I don't want to go into too many details on this, but I will say this. I in no way intend to demean or discredit the hospital and all of the wonderful nurses and doctors that treated me. However, there was one doctor whose carelessness and negligence ended up puncturing an artery in my lung during a procedure. Now, this was one thing, but the worst thing is that he decided that he wasn't going to report it. He simply put a pressure bandage on it and left. 2 hours later, I'm struggling to breathe. Nobody understands what's going on and why I'm having these difficulties. All they could see is that my blood oxygen level was getting lower and lower and lower as they're pumping more and more oxygen into my nose. Finally, they decided to take me down to the CAT scan. By this point, I was suffering. I could not breathe, even at high rates of oxygen. And every time I lay down, I was pretty much suffocating. The only way I could barely breathe, because I had so much blood in my lungs, was by sitting upright. That gave me just a little bit of lung capacity left to breathe with. However, they needed to put me on my back for 5 minutes to do the CAT scan. They put a heavy amount of oxygen into my nose and told me that even though it felt like I was suffocating, I was still absorbing some of the oxygen, and that for 5 minutes, I would just have to endure the suffocation feeling. But I was told I would at least make it during those 5 minutes. That was one of the worst 5 minutes of my life. Imagine lying on your back for 5 minutes while they're doing a CAT scan, and it feels like you're suffocating. It feels like you cannot breathe. And even though I was technically absorbing some oxygen, it did not ever feel like it was enough. When they got the results of the CAT scan back, they were horrified. As they did the time motion playback, they could actually see literal waves of blood flowing into my lungs. I actually watched the video. Literal waves filling my lungs. I needed emergency surgery stat. They immediately cleared the interventional radiology room and wheeled me in. What they ended up having to do is they ended up having to cauterize that artery, basically deadening that part of my lung. I can never use that part of my lung again. Thankfully, I have huge lung capacity, I always have, and so I'm not going to miss it that much. However, this one incident was the start of many complications that followed. So once again, I was in the ICU. Once again, I had a bunch of tubes in me. Once again, it felt like I was starting at ground zero. So how are you guys doing? You still with me? Well, hold on, because there's a lot more to come. I finally make it to the floor for the second time. Once again, here I am trying to recover, this time from a second surgery. 4 days later, once again, I was dealing with complications. This time, I had 2 complications happening at the exact same time. So the first was the fact that I had been on anesthetics or heavy painkillers for over a week meant that I was not passing any stool. And they tried everything. They gave me all kinds of laxatives and enemas, and finally they decided to give me a gallon of the Go Lightly, the kind of stuff that you get before colon prep. The problem was I was so backed up and so clogged that all that Go Lightly did was blow up my small intestine. It was on the verge of bursting. I needed emergency surgery right away. The second complication was that blood was starting to creep around my heart and was starting to collapse my heart. All I remember was I was in the room when suddenly my blood pressure just tanks. I remember being in this weird state where I was kind of bouncing in and out between consciousness and dream world uncontrollably, and sometimes at a rapid rate. In reality, I was dying. That's how I sensed, that was my sensation of it, but that was what was going on. And so 2 surgeries needed to happen. One, they needed to fix what was going on around my heart and all that excess blood and stuff like that. And 2, they needed to fix my small intestine before it blew and killed me that way. There was actually a debate, which one do we do first, because we can't do it 2 at the same time. They decided to fix my heart first because they felt like that was most important. And then they had to poke a hole in my belly to relieve all that stool pressure, and then leave an ostomy bag, and they did that second. What I remember was I was kind of fading in and out of dream world and consciousness, and as they tried to save my life, they gave me this really hot oxygen to start breathing, and this was forcing oxygen into my blood system. I remember it was horribly uncomfortable. I kept trying to, like, no, I don't want this, and then I black out. When I wake up, I see a teal wall. That's right, a teal wall. I was back into the ICU, once again, with a breathing tube and all the other tubes. And I literally remember thinking to myself, you've got to be kidding me. Except now, what I was unaware of was that they actually had given me an ostomy bag. So I black out, and when I wake up, I now have an ostomy bag on my body. That was not something I was expecting either. And the shock of all of that was just devastating. Throughout this time, the pain was so incredible, I could barely function. It was unbelievable. This was one of the worst hells I've ever been through. No, I shouldn't say one of. It was the worst hell I've ever been through. The chest tubes. Imagine taking some rods and stabbing them into your lungs on either side. Yeah, that's kind of what it felt like. I could not lie on either side because of them. It was excruciating pain. Obviously, I could not lie on my belly because I had an incision there. And I also could not lie on my back because every time I would go to lie on my back, it felt like I wasn't able to breathe. So the only position that was comfortable was sitting up. So I literally spent the next month sitting in the chair next to the bed. I would sleep there. I would spend my day there. And by the end of that month, I had developed the worst bed sores, or sitting sores, I guess, from staying in that position the entire time. Emotionally, it was a very challenging time. The pain was so awful that for the first week and a half, I regretted doing the liver transplant. I also was dealing with major guilt because I realized that this new chance at life that I was experiencing meant that somebody else was grieving a loss. And that weighed on me heavily. For whatever reason, the anesthetics kind of fried the emotional part of my brain. And I remember for like 2 weeks, about maybe even longer, the only thing I felt was just pure pain. I could not feel joy. I could not feel love. I could not feel hate. I could not feel anger. I just felt pain. I felt so numb inside. And there was nothing I can do to make that go away. I was so uncomfortable that I pretty much squirmed the entire time. There was no position that I could sit still in that just didn't hurt. So I was constantly moving to try to change the different pain, because whether it was pain on my chest tube or pain in my incision or pain from my bed sores or whatever it was, I was constantly squirming. I did not like having visitors because I did not like them seeing me kind of squirm in this position. It just made me very uncomfortable. My faith was stretched during this time. I could not feel God. But then again, I couldn't really feel anything, so it wasn't unique to him. People would come in and they would read me scripture and they would play me worship music, and that was all good. I really appreciated it, but it didn't really resonate with me at that time. At points, I felt so abandoned. I felt like the psalmist. Oh, where, oh God, oh, where have you gone? Why have you abandoned me to ruin? Eventually, as the anesthetic started to clear out of my system and I started to feel more, I could feel his presence even when it was so challenging. I was sent home on December 20th. That was 28 days after the transplant. I weighed about 115 pounds and I could barely walk from my bed to the bathroom. The surgery actually required parts of my stomach to be repurposed. And so my appetite was reduced, which was not a good thing since I needed to gain weight and I needed to gain it fast. Eating was a challenge. It was difficult. 5 days later, it was Christmas. I sat on the back porch on this unusually warm December day here in the Denver area, and I basked in the sun, the sunlight that I had not felt on my skin in close to a month. I reflected on the holiday, what it meant. It meant the promise of a new life, a spiritual life. And I reflected on my life being renewed through the gift of life given to me by a gracious family. It was a refreshing moment in my road to recovery. Now, the next 4 months had their own challenges and their own struggles, and perhaps I'll do another video talking about that. But this is where I'll leave it. I thank you for sticking to the end. I thank you for watching this video, and I thank you for all of you who have supported me on this journey.